So our next speaker hardly needs an introduction. He's a field hockey player, he is a long distance runner, and he has been with the Integrated since the very early beginning. So please, a warm welcome for my Dutch fellow man, Steef-Jan. Please welcome.
Is it on? Yeah. Is it on? Very cool. Well, it's good to see you again for a while after the pandemic. So I've had quite an interesting period as well. I'm going to talk about it. So I've done a lot of integration with Dynamics, so that's what I'm going to do. First off, I was able finally after 10 years. So this is the 10th time I'm here on stage. And during that time, it also took like completing this, Abbott Big Six thing. So 6 marathons. So finally, in Boston, I did the last one, at least. Well, I'm going to continue, but this is done. So this is, in 10 years' time, I've completed the Big Six. So that's the picture. Currently, I work as a technical architect at HSO. So that's an ISV. They're based in Holland, pretty close to where I live. So I can go to the office by the bike. So that's pretty cool. We have activities also outside of the Netherlands. So you can think about UK, we got some activities in the US, Canada recently, Oceanic, so like Australia, New Zealand. So we're kind of global now. So we kind of focuses on implementation of Dynamics. So you have to think about CE or F&O, or what's called Finance and Supply Chain Management. So it's kind of changed. What I still do is I work for InfoQ. Anyone familiar with InfoQ? Maybe some of you. You definitely check it out. It's about all kinds of cloud technologies, architecture, all kinds of content, I would say, podcasts, presentations, etc. So it's really interesting. Also, if your focus is beyond, like, if it's multi-cloud, you'll find some interesting stuff there too. I used to be a BizTalk MVP. I'm still an MVP, but I kind of transgressed into to Azure, and I also am a part of the Azure user group in the Netherlands. So that's about me. So what I'm going to give you is what's on this slide kind of thing. So if you want to scan that QR code, that's where you can find the slides and everything. So keep that up. So what I will be talking about is Dynamics 365, but then a focus on manufacturing itself and some of the examples, real world, what I've been doing, during the pandemic with certain customers, some challenges, considerations, takeaways. So that's kind of what I'm going to present to you in the next 40 minutes. So let's get down to the business, right? Who knows what Dynamics 365 is, or works with it, or integrates? So I think it's quite a substantial part of people that work with it. Anyone doing that particularly in manufacturing or somewhere else? So what you can use it for is kind of an enterprise resource planning system, which you can use for verticals like the healthcare, manufacturing, finance, retail, that kind of stuff, and you kind of streamline your processes. But that also means that you will probably be interacting with other systems as well. And if you just look at what enterprise resource management is, you might be familiar like SAP, Info, I think BAN, which is a more software one from the Netherlands, Unit 4, those type of solutions that provide modules that you can use for all kinds of business functions, including like sales, forecasting, finance stuff, and that kind of thing. Supporting your business processes, like already mentioned, like finance, manufacture, retail, and so forth. So what would a typical integration landscape look like if you look at it from a manufacturer standpoint? So this is kind of a slide we see. You see some in and outbound processes. So this could be like information going to subsystems depicted in the middle, but there also might be information coming back from those systems as well. So it could be bidirectional or could be one directional, depending on what the process it supports. Could be like, in this case, it's a manufacturing process, but it also includes some of the financial components for invoicing and such. So what are your options with regard to that kind of scope? So what you can do is Odata, custom web services, recurring integrations, and business events. So those are kind of the options, which I will go through, that are kind of typical in this type of scenario if you do enterprise application integration with subsystems. So Odata, who's familiar with Odata? It's a handful, so you kind of familiar with this type of protocol, REST protocol, allowing you to do kind of CRUD operations, database operations, in this case within Dynamics itself. Uses web technology, so you're familiar with like HTTP, JSON, and that kind of stuff. So what you see also here's a screenshot. So we leverage pretty much the HTTP adapter for calling out the OData entities. So depending on what kind of operation, if it's a GET, you kind of put in a query into it, if you really look into OData itself. If it's more like a post, like something you would create, then you do post and then you kind of present a payload. And within Dynamics, most of the public entities are exposed as OData endpoints. So they're available and you can connect to those pretty much easily with the HTTP connector if you would use that from logic apps, or you could use some custom code within a function to be able to call that out. So that's one option, providing you the availability to insert information through OData endpoints or retrieve information from OData endpoints or do updates. The second option is that you would create custom web services, but that would require something like X++. Similarly, if you ever worked with Salesforce, you can use Apex code to kind of do some custom functionality or some kind of query, and then you expose an endpoint. That's another option. So you think about those lines. Anyone familiar with Apex? You should raise your hand. Good. At the end of the day, if you communicate with custom web services, OData endpoints, you will use the Azure Active Directory OAuth authorization kind of protocol. And this, again, is also supported within, let's say, the HTTP adapter or connector, I would say, in Logic App. You can also expose it as a SOAP endpoint if you like, and then you expose it like a WSDL. We use it a lot with just using the RESTful part of these endpoints. Then you have something what's called a recurring integration. So that's something you can set up as well. And it kind of provides this static type of endpoint, which you then can post XML payloads towards it. And then there's a kind of a batch job behind running, and then it will just process that. So if you provide a payload, you'll get a job ID back. And with that job ID, you can even ask, hey, have you been finished, yes or no? So that's one of the options as well. And then we kind of have like the final option, or this is something I want to kind of say as well. You have your recurring integration set up, and then again you can do something with Azure Active Directory or OAuth. So you could say, okay, I'm going to Azure Active Directory with an app registration, you get the token back, and then which you then can leverage to push that payload into Dynamics itself. This particular app registration within Dynamics is kind of connected to an internal kind of, I would say, account. Could be admin or something else. So that would be similar if you did like integration with Oracle back in the day with BizTalk, right? You had credential mapping through SSO. You kind of said, okay, this is my BizTalk application kind of account I'm using, and it's connected to something in Oracle. And that way you could do all kinds of operations with Oracle through a BizTalk adapter. And this is kind of similar with the app registration, allowing you to do stuff within Dynamics. And then you have something like, which is more modern, and this is like business events. So business events is something that if something happens within Dynamics, you could push that information out towards an endpoint, which I will discuss in a minute. This endpoint can be something, or to an Azure service like a service bus, could be an event hub, can be event grid, logic app, that kind of stuff. There are kind of many out-of-the-box events available, but you can also create your custom events. So you can create your custom event to kind of customization within your Dynamics to push those events out. And again, that would require X++ programming. And the way it works is kind of, if you set up that business events or they're available, you kind of have to push them to what's called an endpoint. So this is an example of an endpoint, which is an event grid topic. So you would be able to push some of that information out towards an event grid topic, which then pushes to any kind of event handler. And the way it's set up is that you have to configure some of the stuff that's listed here in the screenshot as well. So you have to provide an app registration, but you also have to leverage Key Vault to get to the particular, in this case, event grid topic endpoint. And then you got some of the other options, because there's many other options with getting information in or out of Dynamics 365. So you can, from the other side out, you could or from the inside out, it could be that you start consuming other services. Would be more tightly coupling. You will use some of the .NET libraries and such, and then you would be consuming services from Dynamics towards other services. Then you get something like bring your own database. So this kind of more for export BI kind of purposes, but this is something that will be deprecated. So it's going to be more towards a data lake. So you'll be pushing a lot of that bulk data into a data lake, and then it can be depending on what kind of architecture you use. So you have something which is pretty modern, which is called a data lake house. Anyone familiar with data lake house? So if you have it in a data lake, then you kind of can do all kinds of analytics or push it out to, for instance, self-service BI kind of capability with Power BI. Then you have another, and this is also more new, it's called data events, and these are more for create, update, and delete type of actions. By default, these are available in your entities, but they're not enabled, they're inactive. But you can make them active, and then similarly to your business events, also push them out to, for instance, an event grid, or maybe better would be another kind of service where you could push that payload to and use it. Then you have something like an entity store, which provides you export capability as well to some kind of SQL database, which you then could leverage, for instance, also through Power BI. And then you got dual write. And this is something that is a capability of syncing information from Dynamics to CE or back, and also with the Dataverse where you can create all kind of business applications. So these are kind of other options, which I will not extensively go into when I'm talking about some of the real world cases that I'm going to show you about now. So I'm going into some of the examples with these options. So this is kind of a Create magazine, one of our customers using this fully automated, but in Dynamics somewhere in this process is involved as well. So this is an example of a real world case where Odata is involved. And this is kind of a hybrid situation. So all my samples are kind of hybrid because we're talking about manufacturing, and a lot of the software like warehouse management systems are all on-prem. They do need kind of a connectivity to feed information in and out, but the in-systems itself, and when you do your order picking, that doesn't require a cloud at all. So a lot of this is kind of file-based, where you push your information to a file share, or you get your information out of a file share. So in this case, it's a connector, a file system connector that you can find in logic apps that requires the on-premise data gateway, which you might be familiar with if you're working, for instance, also with Power BI, and then your data sources are kind of on-prem, and then under the hood it kind of uses a relay. So in this case, it will pick up files by doing this recurrence every 2 minutes, and if there's a file like an XML, it will push it to a queue to get some reliability in. Then that message is being picked up by another logic app, which just does a sequence of processes by what you see here is creating formula lines, approve those, etc. So it's kind of interactions with Odata. So this is one of the examples. And what you would see if you, for instance, push some information through an HTTP adapter to Odata, this is kind of how your payload could look. This is more post-action, and this is what your result could look like within this logic app connector. Second real-world example, again, this involves file share, but then you're leveraging something like mounting your file share on-prem. So that's another capability. Instead of using an on-premise data gateway, you can also mount a file share on an on-premise file share. And then you can also go iterate it through for recurrence, pick up the file, maybe transform it to the payload that you require, and push that through another logic app to a custom web service that's available inside Dynamics. So this is one of the samples or use cases we encounter as well, and this is what we build in the real world as well, depending on the fact that within a web service, you have more flexibility. So you push the payload, but there could be some more logic behind it. And this makes more sense because you don't want to push too much logic within your integration itself. You kind of want to just keep it lean and push information out, do some transformation, but the real, maybe more processing capability you can put behind that web service. So that's what your flexibility comes from. Another one, and this is probably one that you're pretty familiar with, this is a recurring integration setup. This is one I encountered in the real world as well. This is not what we built, but the way it looks at it involves also an integration account and such is that there's an on-premise data gateway or kind of file server that picks up kind of a text file, a dot file, and this is being decoded, leveraging something that you can find in your integration account. That particular payload is then pushed to the Azure storage container, because this is kind of a claim check pattern. So this sends a message out saying, hey, you know, I got something ready for you in that particular storage account. Then it will be picked up by another logic app, which would then do some transformation, like kind of the format that's required for that recurring integration. So it will leverage some of the schemas and transformation you would find inside that integration account. It will then push that particular XML to another container, depending on the file share. They decided to not use like premium, but standard. If you had like Services Premium Alert, then you can do up to 100 megabytes. But in this case, with cost savings, they kind of use that claim check kind of pattern. That's what you see here as well. And then that final logic app will push that to this recurring integration setup. So it will push that payload towards it. And then that message gets deleted from that particular container and then put into an archive. So this is a solution that I saw that another partner implemented at one of our customers. So this is an example. There's other ones that I presented in the past, but this is kind of how this recurring integration would work. And then finally, and this is more modern, where you would leverage business events. You set up a custom business event, or you leverage one of the available business events, which would be pushed out once something occurs based on where you attach that business event to, and with the endpoint I explained earlier on. So your event is being pushed towards this event grid topic. It would then end up as one of the handlers. That's a logic app. It involves Azure Active Directory because of the endpoint setup, but also another app registration to be able to set up that trust and get the information back out in Dynamics based on the subset of information you have. Subsequently, you can do some transformation. You can hand it over to a lot of other logic app that would interact within, for instance, with a function, because the on-premise system requires a text file instead of a XML file, because that machine might require that you push a CSV towards it because it's kind of a modernized system, doesn't expose an API or anything, and it still uses another type of file format, like text in this case. So those are 4 kind of scenarios based on the options that you could have within a manufacturing kind of setup. A lot of it is hybrid. Some of the system might expose an API, and then you would leverage something like API management to do that secure communication between that system and your integration setup, and then you got your dynamics behind it. A sample of a business event, this is a custom one we created. It's called order confirmation. So this is what it looks like, and you would see that there's also a payload which you would use to call out extra additional information which you then would further process. You could do something similar with, for instance, data events. That's another capability you could leverage. I'm aware of this, but some of these implementations were not, using those data events. We're more lenient towards business events. And then you can compare these type of options, right? You can see that Odata is pretty standard. You can leverage it, but you could face some performance issue, which I will dive into next as well. You can have some flexibility with your custom services, but then on the other end would require quite some X++ skills, for instance. The business events allows you to do more real-time integration and exchange of information, and you could use that recurring integration to do some bulk performance or bulk integration type of things and processing. Okay, now we're getting into an interesting part about challenges and considerations. So what I've encountered and seen, and kind of what I wanted to share with you guys. So one is performance. So this is interesting because kind of when you want to retrieve information from an entity, it could be that you're getting a large data set, and that could take also some time while you're only interested in a subset of the information. So that would mean that you can also choose to create custom entities, something similar to what you could have done with a Salesforce and or with Apex code, and then you just create this kind of capability that provided you a subset of the data. And that would decrease your latency quite a bit if you just retrieve or push the data out that you kind of need for your setup. The other two are like throttling, so kind of protecting the system. These are new type of capabilities built into Dynamics. So one is priority-based throttling. Was included, I think, like a year or a year and a half ago. So one of my colleagues came also to me saying, hey, are you aware of this? And what are the list of the customers? Because we made to make them aware of this as well, because this kind of protection on the resource itself, and you can kind of say, okay, I'm going to give this amount of resource power to this type of processes or not. So this is from Dynamics itself. What they recently introduced and what they're going to push out in one of their upcoming releases is what's called user-based protection API limits, and it's more from the user perspective. So you're being kind of prohibited to do maybe a lot of requests, so you kind of set this up too. So again, to protect the system, because there's a lot of processes involved within Dynamics and potentially also a lot of users. The interesting thing with performance is also when you look at when it comes to hybrid scenarios where you would use either on-premise data gateway or something like a store sync, which is a capability in Azure allowing you to sync between on-premise file shares and file shares in your Azure storage, or maybe mounting a file share. The thing with, for instance, an on-premise data gateway, when it looks at a folder, the connector, in this case, the file system connector, really doesn't like if you start pushing thousands of files towards that, file share. It will just give you 429s within, for instance, your logic apps. It's not really a viable solution if you have like a lot of data. So this makes more sense to use something like a store syncs, which is a little bit more stable for it. So think about these things as well. And then in the end, or in general, you always have to look at your volume, frequency, and size. So within HSO, we kind of have best practices or common practice where we also always look at what are our workloads and payloads. And depending on that, kind of provides us kind of a way on how we want to integrate with Dynamics, but also with its subsystem. That's pretty important. If it's really bulk real-time integration, then it's kind of tricky to do this with Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. The second thing is, I used to be a BizTalk guy, and almost like some of my other fellow BizTalkers from the past, and maybe even today, a kind of one-man army. So they have a lot of knowledge and they can do a lot of stuff. However, with Dynamics, this is a bit of a different ballgame. You can't do this on your own. It requires really a team with quite some skills. I've listed a few in this as like your Azure platform. You'd be aware of integration and its patterns. If it comes to customization with custom web services, you need to have like extensive knowledge of X++ and .NET. When it comes to deployments, and you saw this in the previous session, like ARM templates and everything, it's kind of tricky too, because it could involve, and if you've seen it in some of the real world cases, quite some components that you need to either as infrastructure as code deploy them, but later on also deploy the components or artifacts themselves. So you need that knowledge as well. The business process, so there's always a couple of functional consultants involved, well, depending on the process and how things are working and which order your integration services need to interact with Dynamics or the other services. Another thing is like your communication, meetings, collaborations, documentations, all those skills become involved, and they're pretty important to really set up a robust, sustainable integration solution with your Dynamics. A third one, and this is interesting too, is support. I found out a lot of these companies haven't really thought through the support by itself. It's about 20% of time that you're using to build up your integrations. And then it comes to 80%, during the rest of its life cycle to support this. And this requires people with skills, but also business knowledge. It requires that you set up a simple process. It could be even like, okay, you do a triage somewhere with some kind of tooling you use, and then you kind of escalate it to second or third tier support. So you kind of need what's called a support process or model for this. And you need tools, whether it's monitor, when it's third party, you need some time of tooling to help these people quickly identify what's going on and also enable them to fix the issue pretty fast too, especially in manufacturing processes. Sometimes time is money. An example is either you can use something like Serverless 360 in your setup. So this is an example of an integration that kind of monitors the setup with the on-premise data gateway, and where you can see, okay, I've got a network issue. These times that can occur, right? And then you can dive into what to do next. So this is a kind of an example what you could use with a third-party tool, or you could use or leverage something like a workbook. So you create custom-side workbook. And this is kind of what we set up too for a customer, and then you set up a complete set of metrics, et cetera, with notifications. And you can also use, and you might be familiar with too, this is the OMS capability within Log Analytics. So if you start aggregating a lot of data, you might leverage this too. Another thing you need to be aware of too is about hosting. The fact is that you can either host Dynamics on-prem because of some of the regulations, or there's no Azure region nearby. But 9 out of 10 times we kind of see a cloud deployment, a deployment of your Azure, of your Dynamics with sandboxes, etc. And that almost involves a process they have around Dynamics with its releases, because it has kind of a release cadence. They only have like one code base they maintain, so they keep pushing like releases every now and then in a couple of months. And then at some point in time, you don't have support for certain releases. And that all goes through an LCS process. But all other things you might build with Dynamics are also being pushed through this type of process, which has a different release type of cadence than durations compared to your bicep and arm templates, which can be executed like this. So I think that's something you should be aware of as well when it comes to Dynamics and integration. Another thing is security. Security, which I also mentioned before, Azure Active Directory, app registrations, which you would use to interact with Dynamics to set up that trust. And it's good that you might use multiple app registrations and connect those internally to different types of Dynamics accounts. Sometimes we're a little bit, don't do it that well enough, or like, oh, well, you always use the admin account, but that might sometimes be too much authorization you're providing for what you're trying to do in Dynamics. The other thing is that you kind of have to use Key Vault. You have to do it anyway when you set up like this endpoint configurations from Dynamics, from your business event. You need that Key Vault. You can't do it without a Key Vault. So you need that Key Vault for your app secrets, access keys, etc. The other thing that involves with security is because of that network. The network between your on-premise file shares predominantly in your Azure. So that could either be the accounts, but it could also be setting up like ExpressRoute, virtual network and isolation, depending on what your setup is. And when you have multiple Azure components, you might have to think about also leveraging managed identities. The other thing I really want to point out is also that I'm kind of pretty keen or thinking about you should separate your workloads within Azure. So workloads for your integrations, but also workloads for your Dynamics, etc. So really divide them into multiple kind of subscriptions. And then as you can see in this picture, you got like one DevOps account, you got multiple projects, one for your Dynamics. So it's completely isolated. They cannot interfere with integrations or vice versa. And if you leverage like the same, or you're all within the same tenant, then it's pretty easy to also collaborate using Teams. And on the back burner, you've got something like SharePoint for your information exchange. And as you can see here too, because you've got your separate projects, you've got your separate service connections, separate ways of you can deployment, so you can all regulate this real good, you isolate, and it's also more secure. You can also have a setup, for instance, for BI, for your data workloads, if you push data out for BI purposes, when you have a lot of data inside your Dynamics 365 instance that you want to leverage for kind of prediction models, etc. Other things with regards to governance is tagging. So what we kind of do is we tag each type of integration going from Dynamics to third party and back. And that gives us a holistic view also when we start supporting this, where potential issues could arise, but also identifying what kind of our flows is, and you can subdivide them into domains or any kind of ways to doing this. The other is that, and this is just something you should do anyways, like leveraging the naming conventions, think about cost management for your infrastructure use for your Dynamics, but also the cost management for your integration components. So that's why also separating those workloads on different subscription would really help in that area too. Also with regards if you want to apply certain policies, whether it's that certain resources cannot be in certain regions worldwide or any other type of policy that you would do. If you've got like management groups, then you can say, okay, I'm going to push these policies under these subscriptions and so forth. So that's kind of what the governance can do for you and what you need to think about as well. And it kind of brings me to the end of my talk. Around stuff that I've encountered during the pandemic and I've been doing with regards to integrating Dynamics with Azure Integration Services. Some key takeaways. So based on what you're trying to achieve with regards to this particular scoping of when you're looking at Dynamics and manufacturing or finance, is that you have to pick the right type of technology or components or options, which I explained, usually based on the volume. The other thing I really want to stress out is that you really have to think about supporting those integrations from the start. What I've encountered a few times now is that they haven't thought it through, And they keep relying on us to do all the support. But at the end of the day, I'm a consultant, so I'm going to move to the next project at some point in time. The other thing you should not overlook and always take into consideration are things like security and governance aspects. As you can probably be aware, if you look at some of the scenarios I showed you, there's multiple skills required for your team. It's not that you can do something almost by yourself, at least not of like what you may have done if you're a BizTalk guy like me, that you would do all kinds of things with regards to integration with other systems. It really requires a team and multiple skills, and it's challenging. Do not underestimate it. I've been on 2 projects, it's still going. It's like a year or 2 years to really have it completely set up. Not the integration, but also the dynamics, all its process, everything. It's kind of a lengthy project in general, especially also when there's still like AX 209 and 212 implementations that need to be migrated into a cloud setup. It quite some time, and there's a lot of things involved. I might have left out a few things left and right, but it's a lot of things you need to do and take into consideration. There's some resources. So one of my colleagues, Steef-Jan, wrote quite some extensive blog post articles with regards to the integration options. So I've learned some stuff from him as well. There's of course a website, there's a landing page, blog, learn. Like I said, you can find these slides in the GitHub so you can explore them themselves. So all kinds of stuff that really could help you with regards to your journey integrating with Dynamics 365. Another thing I like to think, 2 of my colleagues who helped me out building up this presentation, they've got some extensive knowledge. So again, it's Pujit and also Harman, which I work with on other projects, so they kind of help me out. And some other colleagues as HSO as well. So we're really integrating with Dynamics 365 with multiple of us. There's 2 other people here in the room as well. So thank you also guys for being here. Yeah, I'm still around, so I'd like to thank you. You can ask me questions. I'll be walking around. So yeah, thank you. Good in time?
Any Q&A now, maybe?
Yeah, sure, if you've got time. I was a bit unaware because we were like
we have
10
time.
minutes
We have
late.
time. No, that's fine. We can still take some time. Anybody questions for Steef-Jan?
If not, you can always grab me, but
Exactly.
if you want to do one-on-ones or you want to do like soundboarding or... If not, then probably we'll have another session after
Yeah,
this, right?
indeed. I think...
Sure. Let me just put on my glasses. Another thing that happened during COVID is that I became a little bit blind. I can still run, but my eye somehow is deteriorated. Yeah, scan this if you... Also the physio diagrams, so the diagrams I used in those real worlds are also there. There's some other resources you can explore. So yeah, definitely check out that GitHub. So. Yeah?
Well, I think that's it then, all right?
Did I do good?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
If the audience is happy, we are happy, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I have a question.
Ooh.
Too late.
No, you can. No worries.
I noticed that you are using always HTTP
Connector. Yes.
instead of using Microsoft connector for
True.
Dynamics. Why? I agree with that, and that
there's
to
a
be
better
honest, I prefer this way.
I prefer it this way because it provides better performance. That's one, but also supports multiple ways of, authorization and such and
Expand,
yeah.
So,
Cross company. That's another thing. Yeah, that you got way
Trust
more.
company, I think it's there in the Microsoft connector, but for expanding, if you want to expand your entity, so
No, we always use HTTP connector. That's.
I agree.
and
I agree totally.
If it's functions or if it's logic app, it's
Okay,
always
yeah.
It's very trustful. It performs and it has a lot of options when it comes to authorization. So yeah.
Okay, I wanted just another opinion. Thank you.
Legs. There's another one.
So when you use Microsoft Connector, right, in a logic app, then you have latency issues. So let's say I change something in my Dynamics, and Microsoft Connector works on a polling-based mechanism. It's not pushback mechanism, right? So how do you handle those latency issues?
You mean by push?
Microsoft Connector is fetching data from the Dynamic365, right?
Yes.
Dynamic365 is not pushing data to Microsoft Connector. So when something changes, we have to wait for Microsoft Connector to fetch those data from Dynamic365. So there is a latency issue.
Yes.
So how did you manage that? Did you reduce the latency, or your application was okay with those sort of latency issues?
Sometimes, yeah, we didn't have those. Well, we had some of the latency issues, but they were not really a problem for us. You know, in these type of scenarios.
Okay, so what if we want to do near real-time scenarios?
Well, we would definitely use business events, but also on the other side might be using something like that priority throttling, so pushing a little bit more bandwidth towards those resources. So we do have an upcoming implementation involving a web shop, and we have web shop and other type of orders, and we use these as prior one, so we're using the priority queue and things, and then we kind of push. And we're still using kind of that DMF recurring integration type of thing, but we're using the batch process gets way more resources because that's the way we configure it compared to our prior two orders that will just get less resources, but also less frequent pushing of that information. So that's kind of way how we can handle it. The other way would be, what I know is that if you set up your dynamics, you can also do some extensive performance testing together with Microsoft, so they can on the back side of things also help you out with that kind of stuff too. Yeah. But it's a lengthy process too, what I know. I've never been involved in one, but I'm aware of that. You can also, in collaboration with Microsoft, have dedicated kind of performance testing for a while to set up the right setup for, you know, depending on those workloads. So,
yeah. What we have used is plugins. So if something changed, we can directly trigger, send out the events to event.
I know that there's a partner of Microsoft that also has assets in that way.
Okay. No, that answers.
Which I cannot, you know, mention, of course.
Final question, maybe? Or are we done?
Oh, there's another one. Okay.
So just a quick question from when you were demonstrating business events, you showed essentially what looked like correct me if I'm wrong here, a wizard based in Dynamics itself for setting up an event grid topic subscription?
No, you kind of, within the business event, you got a kind of those, how you call these, tabs. And then there's a tab where you can say, okay, what kind of endpoint do you want to push that business event out to? Because the business event will occur, but you kind of have to push it to, you know, an Azure service, which can be a service bus, which can be an event grid, which I showed you. Because you always have to set up some things with that endpoint. So you're pushing your business event to the endpoint will push it forward. And under the hood, you can also configure it in a way that's kind of a batch process doing it.
So in point of clarity then, you set up your subscriber endpoint using infrastructure as code outside of the Dynamics solution that you then build. So that event grid topic subscription, for example, you would have built in advance using a
Yeah, you have to do all that stuff in advance. Yeah, you have to set that up.
Cool.
I think that's it.
Okay, cool.
I'm
always sweating when I have to do it. Do I know the answer?
Okay, thanks everybody. This wraps up the session.
Okay.
Covey.co